Hey there, YouTube. Welcome back. This is the Allegheny Northern in N scale, and today we're talking about the next step in getting started in the hobby. So in the last video in this series, I talked about getting your train set and where to put your money in your models. And now that you've made some purchases and you've got your basic starter set, you're probably thinking about slapping some track together and maybe putting that track on a board and making your first layout. Now, if you want to, you can tune into any channel on YouTube, and there's going to be what I call a cheerleading video, where the host is overly excited about you joining the hobby and you can do great things, yada, 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 blah, blah, blah. Look, you guys aren't in grade school anymore. You don't need the cheerleading. What you need to do is sit down and think about what you're going to put on your layout. And the fact of the matter is that you're not going to be able to do everything that you want to do, especially not on your first layout. And then even further, you're going to have to develop a skill set that's going to allow you to do everything that you can do. So when I sit here and I tell you, you can't do it, there's some truth to that. But that's not to deter you from starting a layout or trying to build a layout. It's to set expectations. And so I'm going to take you on a journey that I went through in developing my layout. And that journey started in my parents' house in a 10 by 10 bedroom that housed not only my train layout, but also my bed, my dresser, a standalone bookcase, and a desk. So if you do the math real quick, we didn't have a whole lot of space for a layout. In fact, what I ended up doing was taking basically a 2.5 foot by maybe 3 foot, 3.5 foot piece of Homosoap board and setting it on some 2x4s, laying it on the floor, and calling that my layout. And I think I ended up with probably a figure 8 with two industry sidings. One was a station that wasn't even long enough for a single coach, so I had some smaller, like old Western passenger car type deals going on. And I set it in winter, and I really didn't understand winter scenery or how to do it. And so basically, it was just exposed plaster on everything, and everything was painted white, and it really wasn't a showpiece. And that's because, well, I didn't know what I was doing, and I was just trying to make something. And so that's where I started, right? And when you first start out, you're going to do the same thing. Your model kits aren't going to fit together well. They're not going to be trimmed right. You're not going to have the attention to detail. Your painting's not going to be as good, etc., etc., etc. It's to be expected. You're just starting. You're doing something you've never done before. And so don't get discouraged when you first start building all of your kits and your models and putting your track together. And, well, things just don't quite work the way they should. Because when you first start, that you can do it is you really can't do it. And you got to learn how to do it. And so if you are, like most people like me on my starting journey, and you're in a small space, you're building a layout that fits the space. So you're not building maybe what you want. And that was my case. I like running very large modern locomotives and very large modern rolling stock behind it. So in my first layout at 2.5 by 3.5 foot, I'm not running an 89-foot auto rack car. It's just not going to happen. I'm not going to have an SD80 Mac running. I'm not going to have a Gevo running. They don't fit. And so you got to have that idea in mind when you're planning your layout. And most of us build our layout to the space that we have available. And in my opinion, that's logical, but it doesn't really make sense, because we're going to end up sacrificing the things that we want out of the hobby, and then we're not going to get the full enjoyment. So when I first started and I didn't really know what it was that I wanted to do, that little train set on that small board was perfect, because I didn't realize I could do other things because I didn't have the space to do other things. So if you are planning a layout, the first thing that you need to figure out is, what am I running? So what are my locomotives? If you bought a train set, you probably have a little 4-axle diesel or a small steam locomotive. And it's a great start. And you can set up some track on a layout and run that and have a good time with it for a while. But if your desire is to run long coal drags or long auto rack unit trains or long manifests, you are going to need a lot of space. And you're going to need to plan a layout that has a lot of space. And if you don't, then you're going to get disappointed with the hobby because you're not going to be modeling what you want to model. And that's a problem, because if you lose interest in the hobby, then you're never going to develop those skills we talked about in the beginning. So figure out what you want to run as far as your locomotives go, because that is going to be the starting point for deciding how your layout is. Is it single track? Is it double track? Is it modern? Is it not modern? Are the locomotives big? Are the locomotives small? Pick your locomotives first, and that can be independent of your train set, but start with your locomotives. Okay, the next thing and the third thing are going to kind of tie together, and that is your rolling stock. So what are you running? Are you running long coal drags? Are you running short little locals? Are you running intermodals? Whatever you're running, try to have locations on your layout for those cars to go to. So if that is going to, let's say we're doing intermodal, right? My layout presently has a port and it has an inland intermodal yard. So I've got 2 locations on the layout that those cars can shuffle between and generate traffic. But if I didn't have one of those locations, then a hidden staging or even an on-site staging can act as a intermediate or in place of an industry. So plan out what it is you want to run. And then when you do that, now you've got your modern locomotive, you've got your modern rolling stock, and you've started picking out where your layout is running. So in the planning process now, you're developing your track layout against what trains you want to run. So if you're going to, run largely passenger service, then you're probably not going to plan your layout around, say, an eastern port scene. You're going to plan it around a downtown metro area where a passenger train logically would stop or be seen. So that's your next step, is what are you going to run? Okay, because you've picked your locomotive, now you've picked your rolling stock, so you've defined the elements of your layout that you have to have in order to run those 2 items. And then the very last thing is your scenery. What are you going to model? And that's going to be your arrows. So if you settled on some 1920s, 30s locomotives, you're going to be modeling 1920s and 30s most likely. And your buildings and your scenery and your industries are all going to match that time period. So if you're modeling something that's modern, you're going to have very modern equipment, modern vehicles. You're going to have modern looking buildings. And that is going to change how you set up your scenery and what you practice in building your scenery. So, and that's going to dictate what kind of building kits you get. So whether you're scratch building it or building it from kit bashing or just from the kit straight, you need to kind of have an idea of what your layout is going to be hauling and what its purpose is. So you've picked your locomotive, you've picked your rolling stock, so now you've assembled the trains that you want to run, and you've picked your industry, and that has set your scene. So the next thing is, you pick your season and your scenery and go. So those are the next step in planning your layout. So when I asked you guys in the poll how you plan your layout, most of you said you just slap track together until something works. And I'm not going to make fun of you guys, because that's exactly what I did. I put track together until I got a layout that I liked. And I've gone back and I've tweaked some stuff, and that's why I prefer to use sectional track, because it allows me to do that. At any point in time, I can rip up the scenery, pull out the track, and slap new track in. And I've done it. Throughout the course of this layout, I've done it at least 3 different times. I've modified a scene and put in new track. So that's something that I like. And you sacrifice a little bit with the realism with that sectional track, but it's worth it to me because of the flexibility I have. Then there was a very small section of you that about 15% of you that are the prototype modelers. So you were doing your research, you were modeling a specific railroad at a specific time, a specific place, and you're putting in items that match those criteria. And for those of you, you are the more advanced modelers. That is not something a beginner is going to do from train set to prototype. So you guys are kind of like the all-stars of model railroading. And although you guys can produce some beautiful layouts, you still got to start somewhere. So I didn't talk about the big problem that you have right now, and that is you're starting out, you don't have enough space, so you really want to run those big diesels, you want to run those long unit trains, but you don't have the space. So what's the solution? Well, obviously you just don't build a railroad, right? Of course, that's not the solution. The solution is you got to get involved in a club or somewhere where you can take those long cars, you can take those big diesels, and you can run them so that you stay interested in the hobby. But then when you come home, you can work on your smaller layout, you can develop those skills, you can hone in on your painting and your scenery, and you have another set of locomotives and cars that you run at home. So you've basically got your show cars and you've got your home cars, right? And that will keep your interest in the hobby. So don't just get discouraged if you don't have the space for a large layout, because it's very easy to do that, especially now that you have YouTube and you can see all of these, large layouts. But at the same time, if you're only building a small layout, realize that layout is not going to fill your needs. It's not going to suit what you really, truly want out of the hobby. And that's going to become a point of discontentment, basically, and will start pulling you away from the hobby. So as you're planning your layout, and as you're laying out the track and laying out what you want, the industries you want, the cars you want, just make sure you're allowing the proper amount of space on the layout for it. And if you don't have the proper amount of space for it, realize that in some degree you're going to compromise. And depending on how much you compromise, and I'm not talking about, say, selective compression that most of us do, where we take a very large industry and we compress it to the space available. I'm not talking about that. We all have to do that. I'm talking about where you try to jam the large locomotives on a small layout. You're going to lose interest real fast because it's not going to run properly. So you need to find that alternative to keep it going and to keep your interest in the hobby. So my advice to you is threefold. Start with your locomotives. Pick the locomotives you want to run. Build your layout around that minimum radius. Same with your cars. The next thing you want, where are your industries? What are your industries? What kind of cars are you going to be pulling? Rolling stock behind your locomotives. And then finally, pick your scenery. So you don't have to model industries. You could literally just model a mainline run where you can just watch your trains go. And if that's more your speed, then you want to model those long sweeping curves and those double track runs so that you can watch trains. You don't really have to think about it. You can just watch it going through your scenery. So when you're planning your layout, if you started with a book, great. Don't forget you can expand beyond that, and make sure you're keeping in mind your key goals when you're developing your layout, and avoid trying to shove too much stuff into a layout. If you have a 2x3 foot layout, you're not going to be putting in an intermodal yard. It's not going to fit. So when you're planning your layout, plan realistically for the space you have. Okay, that's my advice in getting your layout planning done. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or you want to disagree or agree with me, go ahead and leave a comment down below. And then as always, on your way out, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe.